My name is Eliana Rosas-Aguilar. My field of expertise is disability inclusive research, particularly in the areas of employment, participation, gender and intersectionality. I'm a doctoral researcher at Loughborough University in London, and I'm carrying out my research about disability stigma in Peru.
Can you share why you think it is important for your research to have diverse inputs?
Well, I think diversity really enhances research. I think it's inevitable to think about research at the same time that bring a different perspective about the same issue. I think working throughout disability research in my life has really increased not only my capacity to see the problems differently, from empathizing with different angles to the same problem, but also incorporate different voices to my research, and also understand society differently. And I think it's vital to bring to the table as many disabled voices as one can think about the problem of research of interest, but also I think it's important to bring non-disabled voices to the table. Sometimes one have taken for granted that disability research might be only with disabled people, but it's also with families of persons with disabilities, carers, siblings, also institutions working with disabled people, companies employing disabled people, educators, public officers, people providing services to disabled people. All of them have interesting points to bring to the table when it comes to disability research. Disability research is not only about bringing only one voice. Even within the disability community, there is a different polyphony of voices within the disability community. I think it's very important to remember.
How have you used diverse participants or co-design in your research?
I think in the past, during my professional work, I have mostly approached disability research through participatory lenses. At this point in my doctoral research, I'm going one step further by co-creating disability research. The approaches are different, whereas in participatory research, one can bring as many voices as possible to the table, but in a way, participatory research brings people when the problem is already out there, when the questions are already asked. Whereas co-creation requires to actually question everything with disabled people and bring in disabled participation from the very early stage of the research, meaning the power and responsibility of the research is shared with disabled people, and in an emancipatory fashion way would allow also disabled people to participate in academia differently, not only as participants, but rather as creating knowledge as well. And that is a practice of reversing power dynamics in which normally disabled people act as participants and some information is extracted from them to then provide some piece of research or recommendation. It's different when the research itself brings the voices of disabled people to set out the questions that need to be asked, to decide about the budget, to decide about how the tools are going to be created, what kind of tools for research are appropriate or not, to design the study itself. And I think there is an important difference there because it brings power back to disabled people, and that's the emancipatory research approach which now I am engaging with. And it's not an easy one, but I think it's necessary always to keep in the loop whether or not we can accomplish this. It will be always a process of constantly questioning and trying to shift the power between disabled people, not just as informants or participants, but rather as creating knowledge with the research.
Can you share something you have learned in terms of best practice when working alongside a diverse range of contributors?
I think one of the pieces that was really life-changing was related to the barriers that disabled people experience to access employment. and the gendered barriers. I think I was not expecting to find in the stories of disabled people the difference between male experiences and female experiences, not only from the voices of disabled people themselves, but also incorporating their families, people involved in the public service, in policy making, but also providing employment services directly to disabled people, identifying key issues. And I think it was the capacity to pull all of these actors together to evaluate, to analyze the data that was coming out of this piece of research that would allow us to understand how women experience barriers to employment completely different than men, and how the policy making would require also to take differentiated action to make policy that was inclusive of this problem. And I think that experience gave me the capacity to think after about bringing different actors to the same problem. It was also crucial to understand the companies that were employing disabled people and also the companies that were not employing disabled people, to understand how those barriers were either created, reproduced, or maybe just barriers that the companies were completely unaware of, and how they can actually improve their channels to access disabled women as also disabled men in their...
What advice would you recommend to early career researchers to create inclusive settings when co-creating or conducting research?
I think it's crucial to make your research as accessible as possible. Accessible in terms of universal design, yes, as probably something aspirational, but not necessarily completely finished. I think it's very important to have this binary between accessibility to the maximum of your possibilities, of your research possibilities, at the same time to the capacity to adjust. And in the capacity to adjust, I think it's very important to anticipate as much as possible, to create some sort of flexibility within your research that would allow you to give different solutions to the accessibility needs of persons with disabilities. A couple of things that have been very important for me was to have different formats of communication for providing information, but also to have sign language interpreters and also have captions at the same time, the sign language interpreters, when there were deaf people that were not literate enough to have access to captions, or vice versa, or were not signing deaf people. So I think as much as possible having an atmosphere where actually everything can be as much as possible adjusted. And also I guess the capacity and the disposition to adjust, I think, is something that is very much welcoming. I think it's very important also to make explicit this capacity to adjust. In most of my pieces of research, I would anticipate just adding an extra line saying if this is not accessible, or if there is something specific you require, contact me. Do not prevent yourself from contact for a different format or anything. I think that explicit message is also important for people to trust to ask for something different.
Can you share any common mistakes that researchers should avoid?
Yes, I guess in the same line then trying to optimize as much as possible accessibility and universal design. I think it's necessarily to be optimally unprepared. Like, one needs to be prepared, but not to a point in which like everything is very rigid that cannot be changed. So I think a common mistake is probably one can put so much energy into trying to make everything as much as fully accessible at the universal design kind of standard. But I think it is also important to be aware that there are barriers still, and we're not solving all of the accessibility barriers in one piece of research. So I think it's very important to be kind to oneself who's conducting the research, to be also allowing to make mistakes, and to have the capacity to understand that even though one can be as much prepared as possible, there might be mistakes. and that's an opportunity to learn from those.
Is there anything else researchers should be mindful of when working with diverse audiences?
Yes, I think another element of my experience interviewing carrying focus groups with disabled people is, I think it's very important to be prepared for something that you will not have anticipated as much as you could have tried to anticipate. I've encountered deaf people who were unable to sign when I came to the interview when a sign interpreter. So that means you actually need to be ready to be able to solve the problem or accessibility problem on the spot. In that case, for example, I lean on a family member of this person who was their personal interpreter, because this person was not a signing deaf person. And so instead of paying the sign language interpreter, I rather paid, for example, this family member as an interpreter in that case. So I think definitely working in disability brings a lot of creativity to the researching itself. So I think I think it's just to be prepared to be surprised and as creative as possible. Yes.